This presentation will outline Erik Erikson and Jane Loevinger's student development theories on ego development. Erik Erikson was born in June 1902 and lived till May 1994. He was a German developmental psychologist and psychoanalyst. He worked both at Harvard and Yale, and he was an expert on the development of identity or ego. His research includes ego psychology, child development, life stages, and anthropology. Jane Loevinger was born in February of 1918 and lived through January 2008. She was a Jewish developmental psychologist and social scientist. She was an expert on personality theory, psychological testing, and ego development. Her research includes the stages of ego development, coefficient of test homogeneity, and the Washington University sentence completion test. She was known for developing a number of tests to identify and confirm the various stages of the ego development theories that she created. Erikson's psychosocial theory of development primarily considered the impact of external factors, parents, and society on personality development from childhood to adulthood. He believed that every person must pass through a series of 8 interrelated states over the entire life cycle. The main concept that he espoused was that the 8 stages are universal and individuals face a conflict at each stage that they must resolve. And here are Erikson's 8 stages. The first stage is 0 to 2, which is when individuals, as we developed, understand the difference between trust and mistrust. Stage 2, which was ages 2 to 4 years, the idea between autonomy versus shame. And stage 3, 4 to 6 years old, initiative versus guilt. Stage 4, 6 to 12 years old, industry versus inferiority. And stage 5, 12 to 18 years old, identity versus role confusion. Stage 6, 18 to 35 years, intimacy versus isolation. Stage 7, 35 through 55 to 65 years old, generativity versus stagnation, meaning usefulness versus being stagnant. And then stage 8, 55 and 65 until death, which is integrity versus despair. These are the last stages of a person's life. And some of the information that I found had different rough ages for these stages, but they all pretty much worked together in terms of the various stages that a person would go through as they developed and experiencing all these areas. As mentioned before, Erikson maintained that there were critical incidents that individuals had to resolve. And so he further talked about 5 elements of identity resolution that young adults must experience and experiment with during their maturation, which include experimentation with varied roles, kind of trying to figure out where they fit in society and in their environments, experiencing choice, so making good and bad choices, meaningful achievement, something that an individual experiences to understand what is important to them in terms of their own achievement. Freedom from excessive anxiety, and so individuals have to figure out how to exist within anxiety but not be overcome by it. And then number 5, time for reflection and introspection, and this is one that individuals learn as they go through these other roles where they can become reflective and understand how to deal with certain elements in their life. Erikson's premises essentially were that there is a predominant issue at each stage, and the stages are not watertight, meaning that you will have an issue that you experience, as we mentioned, at each of the stages, and that it could overflow into one or another, which is point 2 here. Issues of one stage overlap with issues of another, and how one has dealt with earlier issues determines how one will resolve later issues. So we learn as we go, and then most important, there is a connection between present patterns of thinking and feeling and earlier unresolved or resolved developmental issues. And ultimately, Erikson also believed that developmental blocks at any stage can be resolved at any point. So these stages are not definitive, and that's probably why in some of the literature I found that there were a variety of ages, because some things could roll over into others. Now, Loevinger built on Erikson's psychosocial model and had her theory of ego development kind of build on that, those elements that Erikson already identified. And she theorized that the ego matured and evolved through stages across the lifespan, and as a result of a dynamic interaction between the inner self and the outer environment. So our interactions with what is going on within us and in the outside environment. And that all of this contributed to the concept of moral development. So she heavily invested in her research in this idea of, as we develop, we increase our moral capacity. And then she created an objective attitude test to address problems. And you'll see that here in a moment, where she had some tests that went along with her 9 stages that she tried to verify in her research. So here she says the ego is a process rather than a thing, and is used to construct and interpret one's world. And here are her stages of development. Pre-social, which is where we are looking for gratification of immediate needs. So a baby will be hungry or tired and will want immediate gratification. And then as we get a little older, we will be impulsive, and as we learn more about ourselves and get a sense of self, we tend to be very impulsive and seek out what we need. And then another stage is being self-protective, which is early self-control over impulses. So we start to learn how to control those impulses when we understand that they don't always have positive impacts. And then we become conformist. As we become more aware of the outside world, we conform to social norms. And then as we do that, we realize the balance between being a conformist and becoming self-aware, which is a model adult for society. So we will change our behavior or modify our behavior as necessary between being conformist and self-aware. And then as we get older, we become conscientious and aspire to achievement. And this goes along with some of what Erikson also talked about in his later stages. We will become individualistic, which means we are tolerant of ourselves and others, and these again are kind of building blocks in our growth. So as we become more comfortable with ourselves, we in turn become more aware of others around us and how that our behavior also impacts others and how their behavior impacts us. We become autonomous, and we can synthesize ideas, and we can be independent and act on our own. And then ultimately the idea is to become integrated, which is all of these areas have built us into a person that has wisdom, empathy, and peace. And she indicated that this level is rarely achieved fully. And then one of the tests that Loevinger worked on were these sentence completion paradigms to help people understand and confirm the various stages of her ego development. So subjects had to complete sentences like, my main problem is being with other people, the thing I like about myself is, and then she would take those responses and analyze to find the stage in which the ego made sense of the particular kinds of experience. So this helped to reaffirm again her theories. And how does this all apply to student development? The following characteristics that relate to Erikson and Loevinger's ego model define some of the students that we typically deal with in the 18 to 22-year-old college student demographic. So many of these students believe they are special, and they have been sheltered more. They are very confident in their skills. They can tend to be team-oriented. They are resourceful and environmentally conscious. And they also tend to be kind of high-pressured and feel pressured, and they're overscheduled and over-mentored. And so that means at times going along with being sheltered and maybe being treated special, that they may not be always as resilient as we would like, but they are as high-achieving and future-oriented as other generations, and even more so in terms of some of the things like being environmentally conscious. And then lastly, how does this affect student affairs awareness? How do we work with these ideas of ego development that Loevinger and Erikson talked about and incorporate that into our student affairs activities? So individual students must be addressed holistically. We've been talking about throughout the term how important it is to address the whole student. Each student is unique, and therefore student affairs must consider the physical, social, biological, and cultural distinctions of not only the various groups as individuals, but as people that have had similar development patterns. And then optimal student development requires an environment which provides balance, challenges, and support. So to recognize all the ego development stages and provide a balance in our services to those students. And that we should recognize that in each of the stages, as both Erikson and Loevinger talked about, there is a crisis, and that crisis can result from disequilibrium and lack of skills. Therefore, student affairs needs to provide basic skills development and coping skills. So some of the things we do in human development or counseling, making sure that we check in with our students. Those are very important. Students will progress at their own pace and readiness through ego development states. So again, treating each student as unique and recognizing that some students developmentally are at different stages or are able to better cope at the stage that they are in or may be a high achiever. Lastly, a behavior is a function of the person and the environment. The total campus must therefore help the student to achieve. So the entire experience for a student is important for them to achieve in terms of the way these theories are written and in their human development. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope that this has helped you to better understand Erik Erikson and Jane Loevinger.